Welcome to the Dialectic, a Fair Observer podcast by the Rajput and the Wasp. I'm Atul Singh, the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. I am the Rajput.
And I'm Carle. I am the Wasp, and we are here to, as Atul likes to say, make sense of the world.
Well, and today, as we promised in our last episode, we will make sense of Post-Brexit Britain. Now, Great Britain doesn't seem to be all that great anymore. In fact, Britain is in trouble. In 2016, David Cameron called a referendum and duly fell on his sword. He resigned. He's also had a financial scandal thereafter, so he's really persona non grata. Well, after him, Theresa May came to power and called a snap election. Jeremy Corbyn challenged her and nearly drove her out of power. And the rise of Jeremy Corbyn seemed irresistible until his fall, which happened with the rise of Boris Johnson. And then, of course, Boris Johnson himself fell thanks to losing 2 by-elections. I suppose his scandals might have contributed too, and some backstabbing helped as well. Anyway, so the rise and fall of Boris Johnson was followed by a short spell by Liz Truss as Prime Minister, who in the memorable... Liz Truss.
Oh, that's right. I'd forgotten that about her.
Who, in the words of The Economist, had the shelf life of a lettuce. And now, of course, we have Rishi Sunak, a former Goldman Sachs chap, a fellow who was head boy at Winchester College, did philosophy, politics, and economics not too long before me, and who's the first Hindu, the first Indian, the first person of color as well to be in the hot seat. And he's affectionately, and not so affectionately, called Dishi Rishi, Richie Rishi, and a host of other names. Sunak the Snake, as Boris's friends would say. Anyway, so now we have Rishi Sunak on the hot seat. And over to you, Glenn. What do you make of all of this? Because you have 100% English genes. After all, you're a good, nice Puritan boy.
Well, there are some Norsemen also. There's some Norse blood in there because, of course, the Vikings, invaded, and so some of my ancestors go back to them too, as well as the French invasion. So I truly represent Great Britain and its moments of cultural expansion from thousands of years ago. Gosh, it's easy to treat the travails of England as farce, and to be derisive, and to laugh, and all of those things are accurate and deserved in some way. But of course, farce is really tragedy with a grimace or a smile, and that's what's happening. We're watching the sort of the end of a 140-year decline. Things don't generally happen instantaneously in societies and states, and England has its apex of power and influence is really probably about 1850, and the decline began probably about 1880 with Germany's rise and then America's supplanting Great Britain. So here we have it's these leaders who twist and turn and backstab and primp. And really, I'll be a Marxist again for a moment. They are sort of the superstructure politically acting upon deeper social, economic, and international forces that are returning finally England to its more natural place in the grand scheme of things. I'm not completely a determinist, but size is important, and a nation of 70 million is a middle-sized power. On top of that, England has made a number of avoidable mistakes, which have given us the pleasure of watching politicians make fools of themselves. And I think Boris Johnson perhaps is the best example of what has done England in, and England has done a lot of itself in, with the fundamental clownishness, unseriousness, superficial, supercilious narcissism of a witty, intelligent, unprincipled charlatan. And that's not what has caused the problem, but rather as a symptom of deeper stresses, to which England is not, about which England is not alone or unique. We have to be fair. The things that have brought England to this impasse are quite obviously roiling the United States and most advanced democracies.
Well, England or Britain is going through a political instability worthy of Italy. And in the words of a dear friend, who's obviously British, he said, living in England today or Britain today is like watching the Romans turn into Italians. So we have now an unending knife fight in the Tory party. Rishi is on top for now. It's highly unlikely he will continue after 2 years. The Labour Party seems set to take over after 2 years, but, and here's a big but, they too have deep schisms. They have not resolved who they are. Who is Labour? The current budget that the Tory party came out with could very well have been a Labour budget too. Are they Corbynites or are they Blairites? And that civil war shall continue. The Liberal Democrats stand eviscerated. Their former Deputy Prime Minister has now become Mark Zuckerberg's lackey. And of course, whilst Wales... we are talking of Nick Clegg, of course, the good-looking multilingual Nick Clegg. And of course, there are tensions between England and Scotland. In Wales, of course, you see mainly Labour and Tory MPs. But Scotland now has the Scottish National Party firmly in the ascendant, and they are very much in power in Holyrood, which is not quite Hollywood for our American listeners. It is a slightly more picturesque place than Hollywood.
Well, 30% of America might have heard of it as something near a Trump golf course, I suppose.
Yes, that's true. I mean, Trump may buy all of Scotland one day, who knows? If he can get away from his legal troubles, that is.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to know, it's hard to avoid focusing on the froth is an unfair word, on the turmoil of the parties and even the constituent parts of England. And you didn't touch upon what I think we'll probably get to speak about at some length, I would think, is the social and actually geographic north-south tensions that have given us Brexit and are at the root of many of these tensions. And a symbol of which actually is the current Prime Minister, because many of my English associates would, I know, not specifically about him, but about an Englishman like him, have recoiled as being the whole reason England is falling apart, that England is no longer England, however anglicized and purely English Sunak may be. And I think fundamentally that gets us to the part of the social and then leads us toward the economic tensions that have emerged and are part cause and part effect of the struggles England is dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, Glenn, you're probably referring to your friends who are older and perhaps to a caller who called into a television station and said, well, he doesn't quite think Rishi Sunak is entirely English. And the reason for him, the reasons for him were very simple. He thought that Rishi belonged to a globalized elite. Rishi had worked in Goldman Sachs. He had spent time in the US. He had retained a green card. He had married an Indian who's now turned into Indian American. Her father, of course, runs Infosys. And
but all you're being very civilized. All of those are completely potentially legitimate reasons to be wary of someone as one's representative. It's a racial issue, is what I'm alluding.
Yeah, that's what the moderator, who I think was British India, made it out to be. But he was framing it as a globalist versus nationalist phenomenon, and the membership of the Tory party would have preferred Boris. And in some ways, Rishi has come to the fore because Britain is going through a financial crisis. The loss due to Brexit is estimated to be minus 1.2 to minus 4.5% of the economy. This is as per the Peterson Institute in Washington, D.C. The UK economy as a whole has been permanently damaged by Brexit, as per Michael Saunders.
If I might just jump in on that, the 1.2 to 4.5%, I'm confident that does not refer to a one-time decline from 1 year on to the next, but the change in the trajectory of growth slower, so that cumulatively England, Great Britain will slip ever further behind what it otherwise would have attained, and relative to other nations. So it is a lasting cumulative decline.
So this is a hit to the GDP. This is a one-time, but it is also, the study goes on to argue that the growth trajectory will be lower because Britain doesn't have the same access to the free trade area of Europe, and that remains its biggest trading partner. And Liz Truss's economics, which was spend more, tax less, ended up in a free fall of the pound, and therefore, as has happened in other parts of Europe, especially perhaps Italy, where Mario Draghi was the prime minister to steer the economy on the straight and narrow, in comes another Goldman Sachs boy, a man who ran a hedge fund, a man who is a multi-billionaire and trusted by the markets as prime minister. So in a way, Rishi, who on the one hand is as unconventional as you can get, a practicing Hindu, an Indian, and neither his race nor his religion were really issues for the Tory party, at least in Parliament. The MPs didn't make any issue of it. After all, they saw him as a Winchester boy, a head boy, no less, which is a school hundreds of years old. And then PPS from Oxford. And they saw his success as a marker of competence.
Yeah. And I must say that of all the, I've interacted, of course, as we all do, with people from all different schools. And a number of times in my lifetime, professionally and personally, I have come to know a bit graduates of Winchester.
Oh,
and it's
Winchester or Westminster?
Oh, I'm sorry. Westminster.
Yeah.
Pardon me. Westminster.
Yeah.
Westminster.
Yeah.
Mistake. Westminster. And of all the schools that I have ever seen graduates come from, it has consistently impressed me as an incredible, spectacular school.
But that's Westminster, Glenn. That's not Winchester.
Yes.
But still, Winchester.
I'm totally botching it up. Okay.
Yeah, so no worries. But Winchester is a very good school. It's an extraordinary school. Some of my very dear friends went to Winchester. Someone I know called Richard Kenny went there, and he's absolutely smashingly brilliant and very well trained. So Wycomist, as they are called, William of Wykeham, set up Winchester in 1382. And it is one of those extraordinarily high-powered schools. And it has produced some prime ministers in the past. It's just been a long, long time since anyone from Winchester made it to the top. But the point I'm getting at is that, on the one hand, Rishi is as new as it gets, but in some ways he is plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they remain the same. He's, after all, a public school boy. He is someone who rose to power under the patronage of David Cameron, then backstabbed David Cameron during the Brexit referendum. He campaigned for Brexit. Then he hitched his star to Boris. Boris plucked him out of relative obscurity, and he was always Mr. Goody Two-Shoes, in the sense he kept his nose clean and waited for the opportune moment. And in the eyes of many, he then backstabbed Boris to make it to the top. Now, Boris himself has backstabbed many, many people, so there are no tears shed for Boris. But Rishi is cut from the same cloth. As a friend of mine in the Labour Party, who is Indian, put it, he said, it's lovely that an Indian is Prime Minister, but I wish it wasn't this backstabbing bastard.
Well, I don't know if we can, if I will condemn him for being a backstabbing bastard, although he may well be. I'll accept the accuracy of that. I'm not a particular fan of his.
I don't accept the accuracy of it. I'm just relaying, reflecting public sentiment. I have no reason to comment on his character.
No, I do think that he is almost a poster child, however, for what are the underlying tensions that have so damaged the political process in Great Britain, and that are causing the country to go astray. And the issues may not be solvable, and they confront many other countries too, but are particularly acute in England. And I can think of a half dozen critical tensions, all of which Sunak embodies, represents. Really, you have, why did we have Brexit, and why are there tensions in the political class and so on? You have the fundamentally a country city, a rural urban elite tension with different interests. The rural areas feeling the less advanced economically and technologically, and so on, parts of the economy and society feeling left behind and done to. This plays out in many ways in England geographically between the north and the south. The south being far more integrated to the global economy, more highly educated, far more prosperous. The south again feeling left behind and overlorded. You have on top of that a critical issue, a social one. You have the tensions between the English who view themselves as real Englishmen who look like me and who have my gene pool versus the immigrant New England that Sunak obviously represents, and there are resentments in any number. I don't associate with particularly conservative social circles when I go to England, but I heard any number of times over the past 40 years flippant, offhand comments, unguarded comments about all of the Packies and the Wogs begin at Calais and things of this sort. Clearly, the social tensions due to increasing ethnic diversity in England, which is the first time ever for England. Then you have the globalized elite, again, of the South and of the educated, more
so fundamentally, Glenn, you're talking about the strains of globalization and a multi-ethnic society. You're saying that these are the two major drivers that have led to Brexit. And now what?
And overlaid on the classic Tory versus Labour, the upper class versus the working class tensions that all societies have, but England quite particularly. So one striking thing for Americans going to England or to Europe are the still shocking class divisions. Not that America doesn't have them, but they're far more acute there. And all of these things have come to our tearing England apart, or if not tearing it apart, holding it back.
But here's the thing, the counter argument to that, very simply, is that um, Britain is not quite as divided when it comes to race as the US today. Britain is now experiencing a change in fortunes. For instance, I don't know if you read this chap in Bloomberg, who's an Englishman, and Adrian Wooldridge, a former economist editor, and he talks about how the rising middle class is in the minorities. Look at the Indians in particular. Sunak's parents, Rishi Sunak's parents, both his parents were part of the health service. His father was a doctor in the National Health Service. His mother ran a pharmacy. And if you look at the previous chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, he was of Kenyan origin. If you look at most people running for office, or quite a large number of people running for office in the Tory party, they were minorities. So Britain is not like the US. You don't have to be white. You don't have to be a Christian even. You can still make a dash for the top job in the Tory party. This is a tremendous change.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
So race is not that important a factor in some ways in lots of circles.
No, I'm afraid I don't agree. I think we're seeing exactly the same issues occurring in Great Britain as in the United States, with a key difference, which is that the original sin, the endless founding division and problem issue for the United States has always been the issue of race. We were born with a compromise. We could only be born making a compromise about slavery. Mm-hmm. And the Civil War remains real today. However, the change of America from the America that I grew up in now 60 years ago to the America of today it's an almost unrecognizable society and country today in fundamentally good ways. We have a Catholic president. He's only the second. We have an Indian black female vice president. We had a black president. There are now on the media, just to give one example, I won't go.
Yeah, but they are all from the Democratic Party. We are talking of the Tory party. We are talking of both Labour and Tory.
That's part of,
it's a big difference.
That doesn't undo the argument, though. I think that the Republicans have become the party of the shrinking, power declining, increasingly agonized and fearful white, soon to be minority, actually, literally minority. But the changes and the progress, all of the indices for American society show phenomenal progress. But it only takes one person on a team to change the tenor of the locker room, and 30% of America doesn't happy. Similarly, I would argue, this is what's happening in Great Britain, but it's only but England has only had now 60 years of experience with dealing with this increasing diversity. And yes, Sunak represents the success, but he also embodies the reason there are divisions.
Perhaps, but here's the important fact. Britain has had 3 women prime ministers and 1 person of color as prime minister, all from the Conservative Party. So you cannot compare it exactly to America. It's a different kettle of fish. And if you go to the south of England in particular, very few societies anywhere in the world have successfully created a multiracial, multicultural society as the UK. So I think it will be unfair to Great Britain, which may not be so great anymore, but it's certainly far more tolerant, open, interesting than it was 30 years ago. There is no rivers of blood speech like Enoch Powell. There is no character like Donald Trump. Even, for instance, Boris Johnson. He declared during the Brexit campaign, of course, he himself has Turkish heritage, and he proudly displayed that for everyone. And he said that he was in favor for an amnesty for immigrants. So I think it's a different. Of course, there were tensions. There are tensions about class. There are tensions about race, but they pale into insignificance when compared to, for instance, not just the US but also Germany. There is no Rishi Sunak in sight in Germany or France, or
I
Italy.
think that I'm not there. I think you're waving the British flag, Anglophile as I am, a little too vigorously. I find that a big part of Brexit, a big part of the social tensions, is that the people in the north, just to choose one place stereotypically, were exasperated and then reacted progressively hostilely to the fact that anyone who came to repair their pipes or paint their homes was from Poland or Ukraine.
But that's not a race
much
thing.
Less
That's not a race
much less
thing.
Pakistan or India.
That's not a race thing, Glenn.
Well,
that becomes an ethnicity.
Class, race, and immigration and culture are all interwoven here.
Yeah. But again, I mean, that's where Britain is different. There's also, I would add that Britain does not look upon the EU with the same memory as Europe does. Britain has had continuous democracy. Britain still had very strong links even until the 60s to the Commonwealth. In fact, 90% of the letters coming to an English village used to come from the English-speaking dominions, and that included the US, because that is where your relatives immigrated to. And Britain never quite had the pull towards the continent in the same way the rest of the continent did. After all, you could trace it all back to Henry VIII. The Church of England began, and it was its own little island before it became an empire. And you could argue that who is Boris but a latter-day Henry VIII with the same appetite and sexual appetite of that portly old king?
Well, I think we've sketched two different, or differing anyway, patchwork underlays for what has led to the political crises in England. What do they respectively then imply for the current situation and the future? For me, I would argue, I hope that it's not a one-size-fits-all perspective, but that England is facing and is struggling with, as is the United States and France and Germany, an existential issue, which is how can the UK adapt to globalization, become a multi-ethnic society. I don't think that Sunak's a sign of the triumph. I think that he's partially that, but also part of the reason why you had Brexit. And what does that then imply the UK will become, and where does it go? It's sort of declared independence. It has declared independence from Europe. Is that viable? I am deeply skeptical that a middling-sized country is wise to try to go it alone when it can leverage its power in a larger entity. I'm a strong proponent of the EU for all of its members. Or are these just the day-to-day challenges of a political system and democracy? As I don't mean to mischaracterize, but I sense you're sort of going towards in your explanation.
No, I'm being open-eyed about the reasons why and the consequences of. I'm not glamorizing or giving the UK a pass. The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development has just come out, and this was 20 years ago on the BBC, that it has just come out with the prediction that the UK will contract more than any other nation in the G7 group next year. So, as far as the economy goes, the economy is down the toilet. It is in disarray. UK is chasing free trade deals with all sorts of countries, including the jewel in the crown, its former colony, India. And for all the seductive charm of Boris Johnson, It has helped him greatly in producing many legitimate and illegitimate children, but it didn't quite help him sign a trade deal with India. And so the UK is struggling economically. Taxes are invariably going to go up. Spending is going to go down. The Tories are not going to be popular. The Sunak, Rishi Sunak, even less so. The big question for Britain is, what sort of country will it become? And as a small, middle-sized country, on the one hand, it has been very active in Ukraine. So Britain continues to be a country that does well in the defense, intelligence, and diplomacy fields. They have a historic advantage, a historic legacy of the empire. You and I have discussed for a long time how the MI6 can be, in many ways, much better than the CIA, and they'll always have our man in Havana. So they are good at certain things. Their universities are all right. They're inventive lot. They have libraries and parks. So they're not going to become Burundi, your other favorite country, tomorrow. But they have aspirations to play a much bigger role than that. In fact, Britain came partly out of nostalgia for empire. Boris had this idea of global Britain. And for Britain to be global is going to be increasingly difficult. Britain can be European in a security realm, but for Britain to be global without being part of the EU is likely to be extremely difficult. And then the question that Britain is also going to face is, what sort of society will it be? Will it be a society that is extremely elitist, wherein only public school boys will rise to the top, and where ladders of social mobility shall be few and far between? And now that the Labour Party, ironically, decimated grammar schools, which basically were the schools that provided social mobility. For those who are American, public schools don't really mean schools run by the government. They are schools set up in 1385 or 1453 or 1543, or whichever date you can pick, to educate the elite of the land. And they cost an arm and a leg. And if you don't go to one of these schools, it is extremely difficult to rise up in British society. And the universities, both of them, I know I went to Oxford, but in England, we are very, I'm not English, but in England, most of the English are very ecumenical. They include both Oxford and Cambridge. After all, there is the Oxford and Cambridge Club as the great universities, and the high positions of all walks of life are held generally by people in these two universities, unless, of course, you're a great football player or a pop star or a rock star. But the point is that class as a dividing factor and social mobility are also going to be important. The cost of living crisis demonstrates that, if nothing else. And then there is the question about Britain once again having somebody from Goldman Sachs. And Glenn, you take a very strong view of this. You say no one from Goldman Sachs should be in political office because the values focus and framework, their values focus and framework are not compatible with public service. But anyway, the point is, Britain also has succumbed to the American fascination for MBAs. A Stanford MBA from Goldman Sachs, who comes from a hedge fund, is now a top boss. So what sort of society is Britain headed for? And that is the critical question now in the post-Brexit era.
It really, not just in the post-Brexit era. I think this has been the issue with capital T and capital I for England, certainly since 1945, and even before. Churchill, much as I admire him, was clearly 2 generations behind the issues of his time with regard to the empire, and in particular India. Maybe it's too much to ask of a person to see beyond his time, but I think he was looking backward, great as he was. But the issues today are more or less the same, except that England is less now than it was then. It's what role can England play? And just as the issue is for the United States now, how do we respond to the rise of China? Those on the right have argued, I know for a fact, well, we have to keep China from rising, are delusional. That's an insane, self-destructive objective, because it is impossible to stop the rise of China. Or even if it were possible, the cost would be so high, and the world that would create would be so catastrophic from every value that I think most all of us listening and I speaking hold, as to be nightmarish. So what does the United States do? The United States, that doesn't mean you just roll over and say, okay, well, China can make all the decisions now. But you have to, there are some tectonic shifts in society, international relations, economic power, and technological advance, and so on, that one has to adjust to, just as we can't be King Canute and tell the tide not to rise. Similarly, for Great Britain, this has been the issue for generations, and it's even more acute now. And I argue it's the acuteness has increased because not of the continued relative decline in global strength of the UK, which is not the UK's fault. It doesn't mean decline. It means others have risen in that regard. But because of the added stresses from becoming a multi-ethnic, open society in a way that societies are now in globalization, and England never was. And I think the choices are either one adjusts to the realities, which means to be a dynamic, open, integrated society that can then leverage associations, and I'm referring to the EU, in a way to increase influence, or one can try to stand alone. And the model that Johnson apparently had in mind was making England a greater Switzerland, or what I would say is that the choice that Johnson and the Brexiteers make, and some factions of England have made for decades, would turn them into the Amish, where they can live as they wish, but are isolated, and they're still driving horses and buggies instead of the space shuttle. I think that's fundamentally the choice, and England, for the moment, has chosen to become the Amish.
No, I don't know, Glenn, if I entirely agree. Of course, Glenn, we must remember that Boris Johnson himself probably didn't believe in Brexit. He thought he would run the Leave campaign, lose gallantly, and then become prime minister. I personally think what happened in Brexit was people knew that they didn't quite like the status quo, but they didn't know what they want. And so some people were imagining that, oh, there would be labor protection. Some other people were imagining that there would be global Britain. Remember, Jeremy Corbyn himself wasn't particularly pro-EU. He didn't bend his back into the Remain campaign. And so there were unresolved tensions, and they were not all to do with just multi-ethnic society, because a lot of the immigration has come from India and Pakistan. I think they were to do also with the fact that there was huge discontent with the political class that was seen as smug, self-serving. Cameron, for instance, someone described Cameron, a Don at Oxford described Cameron very accurately to me. Yeah, he had taught Cameron, so I asked him, what do you think of David? And he said, extremely clever, but exceedingly mendacious.
Yeah. Oh, and they're cynics, no question.
But I think hold fire. My point is that mendacity meant that a lot of angry people, including a lot of Indians, British Indians voted for Brexit. They voted leave. And a lot of that vote was a vote of anger. The left behinds, or as a friend of mine in London said, the swamp monsters came out to vote. And so all these left behinds and swamp monsters cast Britain out. And whilst, yes, Britain is out of a trade deal, at the same time, Britain is still an extraordinarily engaged country by many lights. In Ukraine, they have been extremely active, unlike a lot of the other European countries. Britain is
As
trying
once again, active only possible because they found it wise or useful to follow in America's wake. But were America not doing it, they couldn't
Sure,
do that at all.
absolutely.
They'd be
But
a
they
little
are
dinghy
trying
floating in the ocean.
Yeah, they are all absolutely trying for trade deals. The problem is that they don't have the size and the heft to negotiate them well. As part of the EU, they were the best negotiators. For Europe, it was in some ways a win-win for both Europe and Britain. The challenge for Britain is to negotiate a new future. But having said that, the EU itself is under tremendous strain, and the EU itself is not necessarily going to survive. The tensions within the Eurozone are enormous. The euro is not an optimal currency area. Italy's debts are far too high for Germany to subsidize forever or to bail out forever. Germany could bail out Greece, but with Giorgia Meloni in charge and populists on the rise across Europe, there's no guarantee that the European experiment will hold. And if the European experiment itself dissolves or crumbles or fades away, in Prospero's words in The Tempest, like this insubstantial pageant, leaving not a rack behind. I'm horribly mangling the words. But the point is, if the EU itself crumbles, then the British will look wise in retrospect, without being wise.
Well, yeah, I don't think so. I mean, if one doesn't engage, then others will make decisions for you and impose them upon you, and that's I think really the option. I think fundamentally, we have the current circumstance because the English, enough English, particularly those in the north who were not benefiting from the city, from London, from globalization, or didn't perceive that they were, feel that they were.
They probably weren't. There was very little redistribution. Right. The north was neglected. The south prospered, but as we said, it didn't have the noblesse oblige to share the spoils. The city of London made hay when the sun was shining, but didn't spread the riches.
Yeah, they don't want to have to hear Polish when their toilet is being repaired, or drink beer measured in milliliters instead of a pint, and that's fundamentally it. But the choice, what are the consequences now that you can play in the game and affect the rules that affect you, or you can stand aside and someone else will shape the game that you have to conform to.
And do you think Britain could break apart? Do you think Scotland could?
I did
go
at
to
the
Europe?
Beginning of Brexit, and now I've come to feel less that is less likely. I don't think that Scotland will. It's always finally divided, and probably I think will not. It will continue to muddle along. I'm less. I think it's more likely, more possible, if not likely, that Northern Ireland could revert to Ireland.
But the Irish don't want them. None of my Irish friends want Northern Ireland. Imagine the amount of money they'd have to spend on peacekeeping. They don't have.
Right.
They don't have
Well,
a
that's
proper
a very
army.
important point.
All they have is the police. So I don't think there is much risk of that. I mean, it could lead to a tricky situation where the Northern Irish to vote to join Ireland. Then Ireland would say, "Well, thanks, but no thanks."
I think that's an important point. That's yet more muddle. So I'll say two things. I think so. What does all of this muddle add up to? And of course, no one really can see the future. But clearly, I find the choices that England has stumbled into, if not consciously made, to be cumulatively disastrous for Great Britain. I've said elsewhere that England has declared itself an inconsequential rock somewhere off the coast of Europe. progressively, and I don't accept this the Johnsonian idol of going into the wonderful international agreements and power as a particularly likely future. I think that I think we already are seeing that with Brexit, one of England's great strengths, which is the city, that London remained one of the two financial centers of the world, is progressively going to fade as companies and financial institutions move to Frankfurt and Paris and Shanghai. And so I don't think that it's
Singapore, perhaps not Shanghai. Shanghai under
yes, that's a good point.
And Emperor Xi Jinping is not such an attractive proposition.
No, he is not. So I think that England, even if it tries nobly to pursue this path, is going to find itself disappointed with the influence that it will not be able to attain. It can continue to play, to ply in the wake of the great powers, like it's doing in Ukraine, and that could be useful from a number of perspectives, but that's not particularly independence of action. And then you commented about what I think about Goldman Sachs, and it's a half serious but half serious point, which is that Western democracies, at least the United States and Great Britain, have seen truly a large number of senior government officials, usually in the Treasury and Finance, who come out of Goldman Sachs, or if not Goldman Sachs, certainly the venture capitalist financial services industries. And they have many skills, but I have always felt, and here I will, expose that I am a lifelong civil servant, that people, this common wisdom that business people have skills that government civil servants do not, and therefore should be actually making the decisions because they know how to run things, is almost completely wrong. That's like saying that because I was a good hockey player, you should put me in to play football. Well, no, it's a totally different universe. And I'm not a good football player because I was a good hockey player, nor is a good businessman and the skills and focus and framework that one needs and develops for that necessarily a good political figure. And I find that these Goldman Sachs folks, not because they're from Goldman Sachs particularly, tend to have a narrower balance sheet approach that doesn't incorporate a sensitivity to, awareness of the social complexities and murkiness that is required for dealing effectively in political life, where you have to deal with a drug addict and a CEO simultaneously, and try somehow to find a way forward for both.
On that note, we've come to the end of our time. Britain will still remain a perfectly pleasant place. A lot of Indian billionaires and Saudi sheikhs are going to buy property in Kensington and Hampstead. They will send their children to Eton and Harrow and Westminster and Winchester, and one of those children might even be Prime Minister. So all's not lost for Britain. There's hope yet. The British Library will remain a wonderful place full of intellectuals with great books. Oxford and Cambridge shall remain phenomenal universities, churning out innovation. So Britain shall remain a middle-ranking power. The sun will set ever so gloriously, ever so pleasantly on the blessed green isle of this island nation. On that note, it is bye from now from the Rajput.
And the more cynical Wasp.
All right. Until next time.